Good evening, everybody. Good evening. And welcome. It's so great to see so many people out tonight. I'm Philip Steenkamp, President and Vice Chancellor of Royal Roads University. And I really want to thank you for being with us tonight. I would like to start by acknowledging with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the conference center and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue right through to this day. And it was with great gratitude that we live and learn and work on these lands. Our vision at Royal Roads University is inspiring people with the courage to transform the world. And our Changemakers Speakers Series is part of this vision. So gatherings like these really exemplify one of our goals in our vision, and that is to invite in and venture out. So tonight, we are venturing out, leaning into partnerships, learning from others, and warmly welcoming members of our community. Our speaker this evening is an award-winning author and renowned scholar. Dr. Thomas Homer-Dixon is the founder and the executive director of the Cascade Institute, the full range of humanity's converging environmental, economic, political, technological, and health crises. And using advanced methods to map and model complex global systems, the Cascade Institute analyzes the interactions between systemic risks, it anticipates future crises and opportunities, and develops high-leverage interventions in social systems. And these interventions could rapidly shift humanity's course towards fair and sustainable prosperity. Some of you may know Dr. Thomas Homer-Dixon's work. He's an international best-selling author, published a number of books. Some of them include The Ingenuity Gap, How Can We Solve the Problems of the Future? Another is The Upside of Down, Catastrophe, Creativity, and the Renewal of Civilization. He's also written Carbon Shift, How Peak Oil and the Climate Crisis Will Change Canada, and his most recent work, Commanding Hope, The Power We Have to Renew a World in Peril. Now, prior to joining us at Royal Roads, Dr. Homer-Dixon was a university research chair in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo. And while there, he also founded the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation. He's published widely in the media, including most recently in the Globe and Mail, Scientific American, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And considered among the world's top complex system scientists, Dr. Homer-Dixon's current research focuses on threats to global security and prosperity in the 21st century. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce to you my colleague and friend, Dr. Thomas Homer-Dixon. Hey, Todd. Thank you. Please.
Thank you so much, Philip. It's marvelous to be with you this evening. I grew up in Victoria, so this city has a very special place in my heart. I grew up at Prospect Lake, went to Glen Lyon in Oak Bay, and then to Claremont, and started my university education at the University of Victoria before heading east for 40 years to do graduate work in the United States, to work at the University of Toronto and the University of Waterloo, as Philip was just mentioning. Always coming back to visit my father here and to return to my roots. Very much part of my bones, this landscape, this city, the sea, the forests. And in 2019, my whole family came. Sarah Wolf, my partner and wife, and our children, Ben and Kate. I'll talk a little bit about them this evening. And professionally, I was attracted to Victoria to set up the Cascade Institute. I felt that it was time to take the knowledge and ideas that I had accumulated through my professional career and apply them to some very urgent practical problems that the world is facing. And I found an opportunity in collaboration with the folks at Royal Roads University, with Philip and his team, to build something that I don't think I could have built anywhere else in the country, at any other institution in the country. And we're very excited to see it in its takeoff phase right now. I'll talk about some of the work of the Cascade Institute in some detail this evening. So, hope in the polycrisis. Two words, one of which you're very familiar with and one of which you probably aren't familiar with. We think we know about what hope is and understand the emotion. You aren't familiar with the concept of polycrisis. It's a neologism, it's a new word coined originally by the French philosopher and complexity theorist Edgar Morin in a book in 1999, so it hasn't been around for very long. Came into wide use in Europe in the late teens, and then especially at the last World Economic Forum meeting in January of this year. Got a lot of circulation. But it has been a focus of the Cascade Institute's research for quite some time, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that research this evening. But interestingly enough, hope is a more tangled, difficult idea to get your head around than the polycrisis. The polycrisis may be a new word, but it's actually in some ways easier to understand. It's kind of a shorthand word for a lot of stuff going wrong all at the same time. The sense that the world seems to be going haywire. And some people might say, well, that's always been the case, but I'll argue tonight that there are some things that are really fundamentally different about our world today. That there is something new, and you can characterize that in part by calling it a polycrisis. So you think about the things that we've been dealing with for the last 5 or 6 years, relatively short period of time. These wildfires that are sweeping the world, affecting BC very notably over a number of years, but California, Australia, Siberia, now we see, of course, in Alberta and Halifax, obviously driven substantially by climate change, a pandemic that swept across the planet and literally changed the course of human civilization. We don't know exactly how and in what ways it has put us on a new pathway, but there's no question that has happened. Deep dissension within our societies, especially Western societies, over systemic racism and imbalances of wealth and power that have not been addressed effectively. The largest migrations, forced migrations in the history of the species taking place right now. People fleeing war, climate events, extreme weather, social breakdown, corruption in their governments, lack of economic opportunity. Climate change again, the drumbeat of climate change, always kind of in the background, and then sometimes very prominently with the heat dome, with the atmospheric rivers in BC. It sometimes seems like BC is in fate's crosshairs, that we're being taught a lesson or something. I don't believe in that kind of thing, but we've certainly been shocked a lot. A war in Eastern Europe, which still could escalate into a form of catastrophic proportions, perhaps even a nuclear war. And again, the drumbeat of climate change this past year in Pakistan, a third of the country was underwater. A third of the country was underwater because of the storms that were substantially driven by warmer weather, hotter atmosphere that can contain more water. At the Cascade Institute, based on partly because of work that I've been doing for now almost 20 years, looking at the implications of converging crises, we have really focused on the relationships between all these different challenges that humanity is facing. What are the deep connections between them? And we make a distinction between stresses that are building up under the surface of the global system, stresses like widening economic inequalities, climate heating, biodiversity collapse, major migrations, demographic shifts, population aging. There are probably about 15 or 20 major long-term stresses that you can identify that are affecting humanity's outcomes, for better or for worse, and trigger events, which are much less predictable. The stresses you can sort of track over time, you can see the trajectory they take, and trigger events are much less predictable. They are what statisticians would call stochastic or random. And we tend to pay attention when a crisis occurs. You need both a trigger event and the stress. The stress has been building up over a period of time, and then the trigger happens and you get the crisis. So you need both of those. They're both necessary conditions. But we tend to pay attention to the trigger event and not the stress. But it's the stress change over time that we really should be paying attention to. And one of the things we found in our research on the polycrisis at the Cascade Institute, and by the way, when we say the Cascade Institute, we're interested in two kinds of cascades: pernicious cascades, knock-on effects between systems that can do a lot of harm, and virtuous cascades, changes that cascading changes across systems that could lead to benefits for humanity, what we would call virtuous cascades versus pernicious cascades. Well, the polycrisis is a set of pernicious cascades, connections between systems that are producing a lot of negative harm for human beings. And one thing we have noticed with these stresses is that for most of them, we see these three phenomena. The stresses are amplifying, accelerating, and synchronizing simultaneously. So by amplifying, we mean they're getting worse. So take climate heating, for example. In 2000, the surface of the planet was around 0.72 degrees warmer than it was during the pre-industrial period. So there had been a warming of about 0.72 degrees. Now, so just 20 years later, we're at about 1.2 degrees warming, right? So the problem is worse than it was. But it's also getting worse faster. So there's an acceleration happening. Between 1970 and 2010, the warming per decade was about 0.18 degrees Celsius. It's estimated that between 2010 and 2040, the warming per decade is going to be about 0.27 degrees Celsius. And that's an increase in the rate of warming of about 50%, what statisticians would call the second derivative. So you're getting an acceleration, and many of these problems, these underlying stresses, are accelerating. That's somewhat understood. Certainly that they're getting worse is understood. That some of them are accelerating is kind of understood by policymakers and scientists. But what's not so understood is the fact that a whole bunch of systems, many of these systems seem to be tipping in a negative direction simultaneously. That we're getting economic crisis, inflation, geopolitical problems, climate change, major migrations, internal instability within societies, all happening at the same time. Now, some people would think that's just kind of a perfect storm. They would actually call it something like a perfect storm. But that makes it sound like it's just a coincidence that all this bad stuff is happening simultaneously. At the Cascade Institute, we think there's a great deal of evidence that there are connections, many of which are invisible, between these separate stresses that are causing crises to synchronize. And so a major focus of our research is on these synchronization effects. I'm not going to say much more about that today, but we think we have some tools that can allow us to understand synchronization better. In terms of amplification and acceleration, this waveform diagram is sort of a nice metaphor, graphical metaphor for the increasing severity of crises and the increasing frequency of crises within our world. So here we have the increasing amplitude of the wave, crossing harm thresholds that are defined by the values within a society. So as the shocks increase in their amplitude, you get outcomes that are defined as crises. And the crises are happening more frequently because the frequency of the wave is increasing. As you can see, a kind of compression of the waveform as you get towards the right-hand side. You look across the bottom, and I've just put in the standard list of zoonotic viral diseases. These are viral diseases that have jumped from a natural reservoir into the human population. And these are the major zoonotic viral disease outbreaks going back to HIV in 1980, SARS 2002, H1N1 2009, MERS 2012, Ebola 2014, Zika 2015, and you see up through the end there. And the noticeable thing that it seems like they're happening faster. It seems like the period of time between these outbreaks is being compressed. And that's what we're trying to capture with this particular graphical metaphor that you see on this slide. So what does this mean in terms of our everyday lives? Well, we can trace out the impacts of these problems, of these crises, in terms of our well-being on a day-to-day basis. Soaring housing costs. Well, the pandemic encouraged governments to pump enormous liquidity into economies around the world, much of which was pumped into real estate and equity prices, and gave a very sharp boost to housing prices in the Western world especially. Labor shortages, inadequate medical services. We're familiar with all of these kind of downstream local effects from these larger phenomena that are happening in the world. Infrastructure damage from climate change, inflation, all of these things tend to contribute to economic and social marginalization, and especially a sense of insecurity, a sense that things are out of control, that our leaders don't know what's going on, and producing an emotional response of fear. And in some ways, it may well be that this century will be a century characterized by the emotion of fear for many people. And fear doesn't stay fear, it often becomes anger. And anger and fear are often exploited by folks who use those emotions as a way of building their political authority, to deepen divisions within their society, to draw together their followers into sort of a fevered pitch, and use the exploitation as political opportunists, use the exploitation of fear and anger to build their authority and power. And this isn't something that we know now is just characteristic of, say, America or other societies around the world. We see the same kind of distemper, the same kind of emotional reactions and social divisions that are being politically exploited in many cases in Canada now. And I think we shouldn't have been surprised by the truckers' convoy, but now we understand that these phenomena are occurring in our country too. So what do we do? How do we respond to this global polycrisis? And I could do a whole talk on our analysis of the polycrisis, the specifics of how these stresses connect together, how triggers and stresses work to produce certain kinds of crises, how certain kinds of crises can cascade to produce others. But I think you get the idea. I think you get the sense that we're in trouble. So what do we do? In particular, how do we orient ourselves as individuals and as societies in this world that seems to be such a scary place, and not just succumb to fear and anger? Well, I argue we must address this global polycrisis along two simultaneous pathways. And the first is pretty obvious. You actually have to deal with the underlying drivers, the stresses that are causing these problems. You need to get a handle on carbon emissions. You need to deal with economic inequality and insecurity, with systemic racism, with ideological polarization, and the whole list of things. And we're not doing a very good job on many of these right now. It's one of the things that's leading to what I would call the delegitimization of our technocratic elites. In other words, because they're not solving our problems very well, people are not supporting those elites in their management of our societies as much as they were. And they're turning to other kinds of explanations and other kinds of leaders for comfort and for answers in a world that's very scary. Well, we need to do a better job. And I will talk more about this, especially with carbon emissions, how I think we can do a better job. But we also, secondly, need to address the psychological impacts of the polycrisis. And you have to do this because if you don't address the psychological impacts, the anger and the fear, then you're not going to get any of the solutions because people will give up. They'll fall into despair, or they'll be distracted by fighting with each other, and they won't actually address the underlying stresses and problems. And this is where hope comes in, because hope is really the antidote to fear and anger. And I realized that after having written 2 books that were essentially diagnostic, that unpacked the challenges humankind is facing, the ingenuity gap and the upside of down. I realized that I fundamentally had to address what this is doing in our minds to our sense of possibility and our sense of hope. And there's the book, Commanding Hope, which is right there too, and there are copies outside on the table for sale. So this book I wrote fundamentally for Sarah and the children that I've had with Sarah Wolf. That's Kate. This is a photograph in 2012. That's Kate on my shoulders, and Ben holding my hand on the beach. So Kate was 4 and Ben was 7 at that point. And this is about when I started writing this book. And it took me 8 years. It was far harder than any other book I've ever written. And I was trying to answer the question, what am I going to tell? What are Sarah and I going to tell Ben and Kate when they grow up and they start to realize what kind of world they're growing into? And my guess is that many of you, with your children or your grandchildren, have asked the same question. And 100,000 words later, I had sort of an answer. But it's really, really hard. And it's really, in the end, it was about how do we sustain their hope? We noticed, even though we didn't spend a lot of time talking to them about world problems, we noticed that every time they heard about something like climate change or a war somewhere, but especially climate change, because that's very scary for young people, Ben or Kate would say, "Oh, well, we're doomed." So they would use a vernacular word. You can imagine which one. And both of us, both Sarah and I, automatically would reach into the toolkit for hope. That's what you do. But you're not, right? You're not doomed. It's not the end of the world. You're not foobarred or whatever you want to say. There are things you can do. There are things we can do. There's still possibility in front of you. So this is important because I realize that hope is actually an essential emotion. And there's a big debate about whether we need hope, as it turns out. As hope gets harder to get, some people say, well, we should just jettison it. It's not so important. But you don't do that with your kids, right? And I thought to myself, no, what we need to do is have a much more muscular notion of hope. The title Commanding Hope basically says it's a double entendre, an intentional double entendre. Hope is a plastic emotion. We can make it into what we want to a certain extent. So we command it to be different from what we conventionally think it to be. And that more muscular form of hope can command us to make us feel that we have more agency in response to our problems. So starting with hope is a very critical leverage point in addressing the challenges we face. Philip mentioned that the Cascade Institute is interested in identifying high leverage intervention points, places where you can go in and make a relatively small intervention to produce a really big change. Well, I happen to think that hope is one of those places. It's an emotion that is ripe for reconfiguration, rethinking, reimagining. It's essential if we're to solve problems like the polycrisis, because if we don't have hope, we're not going to bother trying. I mean, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Right? But hope isn't simple. And my argument in Commanding Hope is kind of a full-throated response to the folks who would who espouse a particular kind of hope, which I sort of call it's not so bad kind of hope. It's not so bad with hyphens between the words, right? So they go out and say, well, it's not as bad as that, because you look around, you see these good things that are happening in the world, and there's always lots of good things happening, and that's good. But the larger picture may be really terrible. But instead they focus on the good stuff, and that's how we are supposed to sustain our hope. But people aren't stupid. They step back and they think, well, the larger picture is really bad. And so that's not a very effective form of hope. And in fact, it's ripe for attack by a whole bunch of people who think that hope should be tossed out the window, defenestrated. I love that word. I don't get a chance to use it very much. People who claim that hope is fundamentally and inescapably false. It leads us to shift or distort the probabilities of the future that we want so that we're more optimistic than we should be. They're basically biased. We're biased thinking that the probability of a hopeful future is higher than it actually is. It's naive because they would say, these critics would say, because it doesn't give us a clear sense for how we get from here to there, from where we are right now to the future that we want. And then it's conducive to passivity because in many cases, people will say, I hope it's going to get better. I hope that the world will not breach the 2 degrees Celsius barrier, but there's nothing I can do about it, so I'm just going to sit back and wait and watch. Well, I think those critiques of the standard understanding of hope are perfectly valid. So what I propose in Commanding Hope is a notion of hope that counterposes to each of those critiques an alternative understanding of hope. Hope that's honest instead of false, astute instead of naive, and powerful instead of passive. I'm not going to talk about all of those this evening, but the triplet, I believe, creates a very powerful, muscular, robust notion of hope that works well in a world where things seem to be falling apart, and that keeps you focused on taking a step forward to try to make it a better place and keeping your emotional and psychological well-being at the same time. So let me say a few words about honest hope. And I'm going to link these comments back to those two things I said that we need to do in response to the polycrisis. We need to solve the underlying stresses, and we need to deal with the psychological impacts of the polycrisis so that we don't slip into despair, fear, and anger. So let's start with honest hope. And here I'm really going to focus on practical solutions. So basically that first response, which is let's deal with some of the underlying challenges. There's a deep tension between hope and honesty. And that's why you get the it's not so bad kind of hope. Because when you take a really close look at what's happening in the world, and I spend a lot of time reading climate science, it's not a pretty picture. And this is a conversation that climate scientists are having all the time about how they cope with what they're learning about what's happening in the climate, right? So honesty can actually threaten hope. If the world is dangerous and moving in what appears to be a negative direction, honesty about that can be threatening to hope. You have to have a kind of hope that is able to buffer itself against the reality of what's happening. We're all much more susceptible to the reassuring lie than to the inconvenient truth. All of us. This is just natural. It's human nature, right? We like to be told that our leaders have this under control. We like to be told that it's actually not a problem and it's all being made up by a bunch of scientists who want to pad their research budgets, right? Because that allows us not to have to think about it. But this is what's happening. This is the measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and on the top of mountains in Hawaii, Mauna Loa, and then more recently a different mountain because they had to move the observatory. And it's still an exponential curve. We have been working on climate issues supposedly for about 4 decades. We've certainly been talking about them for 4 decades, and we've invested a lot of money to try to get our carbon dioxide emissions down. But primary energy consumption in the world, 75% is still from fossil fuels. And I don't see any real change in the direct trajectory of that curve. You might wonder why, by the way, why it's a sawtooth arrangement. It's because you get this pulse of carbon dioxide in the northern hemisphere in the fall as you get the decay of vegetative matter, and then it's sucked back out of the atmosphere the following spring as photosynthesis starts to kick in. But the trend line, if you draw a line through the sawtooth, and you can see that it's steadily upwards. Supposedly, we reduced our carbon dioxide output globally about 7% during the pandemic, which is, you can see, should be 2020 to 2021 right there. I don't see much difference, do you? So the way I characterize this in the book, and this is at the core of honest hope, is that you have to actually come to terms with what I call the enough versus feasible dilemma. And it's really acute with something like climate change. On the one hand, changes that would be enough to make a real difference, let's say to keep temperature to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius on the planet. Changes that would actually get us there with technologies, institutional changes, carbon taxes, whatever, aren't politically, socially, culturally, technologically feasible. On the other hand, changes that are feasible, the stuff we can do, isn't going to be enough to keep us to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And this is a dilemma that actually crops up for just about every one of these stresses. There's the stuff that we think we can do politically and socially that's feasible, and we kind of do that, and we just hope the problem isn't as bad as it looks, right? Because we can't get to enough. Well, it turns out that changing the light bulbs wasn't enough, right? That cartoon I noticed today was done in 2007. Extraordinarily prescient, given what we're seeing around the world today. So how do you think about this? Well, being kind of a bit of a nerd who wants to get really analytical about things, I think in terms of a Venn diagram, and you can think of solutions for the climate problem that would be enough and those that would be feasible. And too often right now, it seems like these two sets of solutions don't overlap. And the first thing, if you're going to have honest hope, is to recognize that this is a real problem and not shove it under the carpet. The second thing is you have to try to find solutions that are in that overlap zone. You have to try to create that overlap. And so I'm going to talk for just a few minutes, I'm keeping an eye on the time here, just a few minutes about what I think we can do with respect to climate that we're working on at the Cascade Institute that's both enough and feasible, potentially both enough and feasible. So this is now addressing the underlying stress of climate change. You create honest hope by actually focusing on practical solutions to problems. And the problem of the polycrisis is going to be increasingly driven by climate change. And climate change, being really reductionist about it, that's why I have a kind of pointy text here, is mainly a problem of providing huge quantities of high power density, zero carbon energy. And the key concept there is high power density. It means you need sources of energy that produce a lot of watts per square meter on the surface of the planet. Okay? So depending on how you calculate, how you add up the area that's used by oil rigs and oil wells and stuff like that, a standard natural gas or oil well will produce thousands of watts of energy per square meter. A nuclear power plant, about 1,000 watts per square meter for the area of the nuclear power plant. In downtown Toronto, the towers, TD Tower and the likes, the big Scotiabank towers, they're all consuming 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 watts per square meter. Right? So there's kind of congruity between our sources of energy in terms of power density and our power density of consumption, especially in our urban areas or in our factories and processing plants, aluminum smelters and the like, where you need thousands of watts per square meter. The problem with these guys is that solar wind in a big wind array produces 4 or 5 watts per square meter, and solar in a big solar array maybe 40. Which means you have to cover huge areas of land in order to provide the power to maintain the kind of complexity, high energy intensity societies that we're used to and technologies we're used to. Now, maybe we can live really differently, but I'm not sure actually we'd want to live in that world with much less energy intensity. And I'm not sure we want to cover a lot of the landscape when we should be giving it back to nature at a time it's under enormous stress from climate change with wind turbines and solar panels. And oh, by the way, research just 2 weeks ago said these guys are chewing up bats all over the world, killing a lot of bats, okay? Birds too, probably. So what we're focusing on at the Cascade Institute, and I'd love to do another talk about this someday because I can get really fanatical about this one, is what we call ultra-deep geothermal power. It turns out there's enough energy to power the entire species for any kind of projects and societies we want to build, thousands of times over, about 10 kilometers that way. It's not very far away, it's just really hard to get to. And we need to be able to drill through really hard rock. I put myself through university when I was at UVic. I was going out to Alberta every summer, working in the oil patch. I worked as a motorman and a roughneck on oil rigs and gas rigs, so I know something about drilling. And the kind of drilling we do that we're really good at is through soft sedimentary rock. We need to be able to get through rock that is 100 to 1,000 times harder. Igneous rock, metamorphic rock, and we need to be able to do it fast and cheaply.
we believe at the Cascade Institute that this is actually a technically tractable problem. You go around the world and you talk to drilling companies and drilling teams, and they tend to be led by Canadians. But the most advanced research on drilling deep, fast, cheaply through very hard rock is not in Canada. It's in the UK, it's in Slovakia, and it's in the United States. That doesn't make a lot of sense. We should be at the frontier here. And we believe that this is a power source that could literally power the planet. The cool thing about it is that you can drop the wells in the middle of a city, and you don't need a huge grid to supply the power. You can take, with a company that's pioneering this in the United States with microwave technology, wants to take existing thermal-fired power plants, coal-fired power plants, strip out the boilers, drop the wells on the site of the power plant, and hook into the existing turbines and use the grid that's linked up to the power plant. So you don't have to build any more electrical infrastructure. This is serious stuff. It's going to be done. This is a technical problem that's way easier than fusion, on which we have invested hundreds of billions of dollars. And it can give us the kind of zero carbon, high power density, thousands of watts per square meter power anywhere on the planet that we need. So that's a high leverage intervention point. And it's a reason when Kate and Ben say, what can we do? I say, well, one thing we can do is develop ultra deep geothermal power. So I'm going to leave that because I am starting to rant a bit and get. There's our paper if you want it. It's online. And we're just ramping up a major research project in this area. So let's talk about powerful hope, and I'll see if another 5 minutes or so and we'll be done. This is really now, so the first response to generate hope is to actually do something in the world, a practical project. In this case, I'm proposing major investment in ultra-deep geothermal power, which could involve all kinds of financial and technical expertise, produce employment opportunities across the country. Very exciting. But we also need to work on what's happening in here in terms of what kind of opportunities and possibilities for the future that people see. And powerful hope, so I've gone from honest hope to powerful hope. Powerful hope is really about having a vision of the future. Now that vision of the future may include things like geothermal power, but I actually don't think that's the important. When you think about what the future is going to be like, sometimes we imagine, an urban landscape with things flying through the air, people eating test tube meat, different kinds of social and political arrangements. But really what we should be focusing on in terms of our clear vision of a desirable future are the principles on which it's anchored, on which it's based. And in the last chapter of Commanding Hope, I tried to sketch this story. We can talk about the technologies, we can talk about the institutions, but what kind of societies are we going to have? What kind of world are we going to have in terms of the moral foundations and the principles on which it's based? And there are four that I identify: security, opportunity, justice, and identity. And security is really about trying to reassure people that the dangers they're seeing can be managed, and that that their lives aren't going to fall apart, and the people that they love the most aren't going to be threatened by these changes in the world. Opportunity is about giving people the sense that they can flourish in the future, that they won't be constrained by danger and threat, but they can still express their agencies in ways that allow them to flourish. And then justice is reassuring people that the distribution of wealth and power and resources will be fair within the society, no matter what position they have within that society. Security, opportunity, justice. And then identity, finally, is about creating a sense that we're all in this challenge together, a sense of a moral community or a moral commonwealth, to use the term that I like from the late Berkeley sociologist Philip Selznick. And I would say a little bit about all of these, but I didn't just pull them out of thin air, because they're really grounded in my understanding and research on the nature of human beings, especially what I would call their emotional temperaments. And this is a chart that I have in my book, where I suggest that people kind of sort themselves into three categories. Now, not entirely. All of us expressed at least, or most of us express at least part of each one of these possibilities. But there will be tendencies for people to migrate towards one apex of the triangle rather than another. Exuberant people with an exuberant emotional temperament are extremely excited about life. They're passionate about exercising their agency. Their principal aspiration is opportunity. They have an aversion to constraint and limits. They hate pessimists. And they are joyful people. We all know them. Prudential people are much more aware of the dangers in their world. And they have an aversion to danger and recklessness and profligacy. But I would say, and I could argue about this, I would say that they are much more responsive to the emotion of awe than others. And then empathetic people are those who are concerned about the state and well-being of other people, and they're deeply compassionate, and their principal aspiration is justice and fairness. Now you can see that the principles on which I think we should build our future vision correspond to the first three of these emotional temperaments. So why am I saying this? Because what happens in our society is, if you look, for instance, at the political programs and the rhetoric of our dominant political parties, those on the right will tend to appeal to two of these three categories, say the exuberant and the prudential, and those on the left will appeal to two, say the empathetic and the prudential. And it exacerbates deep divisions that don't bring us together in a hopeful way around the challenges we face. So any vision of the future, I would argue, that is worth its salt and is going to encourage people to pull together into that moral commonwealth I was talking about, has to appeal to all three of these categories of people and bring them together around common projects. And that leads to this last principle of identity, this sense of having a common notion of we that brings us together. The Australian Princeton philosopher Peter Singer has talked about the broadening radius of our moral scope, of those we include within our moral community, potentially to include biota and animals, for instance, outside the human community. I'm really focused on the extent to which we can create a sense of community at the planetary level, okay? Now, this sounds terribly naive, but one thing that I've noticed in traveling around the world, doing research, social science research in a dozen or so countries all over the world, is that those societies that function best to solve their problems are those with the strongest sense of a commitment to the common weal, from the top of the society to the bottom, from the elites to the bottom rungs, socioeconomic rungs in the society. Those societies where everybody has a sense, or more people have a sense, that they're kind of in it together and that they are responsible for the well-being of each other, are the ones that do best. And those where everybody's kind of out for themselves, and especially the elites start to defect and just defend their own interests, as we're seeing in the United States right now, run into terrible trouble. So I don't think we're going to evolve this sense of species-wide moral community, a species-wide sense of we-ness easily. I think it could be an enormously traumatic, difficult process this century, potentially involving a huge amount of violence. But I also think that it's a genuine possibility for these three reasons. Because things are really different now than they ever have been before on this planet, ever before for the species. We are more connected together than we ever were before. We have abundant scientific knowledge about the nature of the problems we face, and we have this emerging awareness of common fate, a recognition that when it comes to problems like climate change and the pandemic, we're either going to solve them together or we're not going to solve them, and we're all going to slide down the slope together, maybe the wealthy and powerful a little bit farther up the slope, but ultimately will meet the same fate. Now, just to give you a sense of how different things are, oops, I'm over time, must wrap up. how different things are. Hyperconnectivity. Between middle of March 2020 and the middle of April 2020, 4 billion people, about half the world's population, locked down. Between the middle of March 2020 and the middle of April 2020, the concept of social and physical distancing went viral and around the planet and changed people's behavior all over the planet. Never has such a large fraction of the human species changed its behavior so fast. And that was entirely because of the connectivity within the system, the information connectivity within the system. Abundant scientific knowledge. Within 2 days of the Chinese downloading the RNA sequence for the SARS-CoV-2 virus in January 2020, Pfizer and Moderna had the morphology of the vaccine molecules they were going to manufacture, the basic shape of them. The period of time after that, before we got the vaccines into our arms, was taken up with testing. But the previous average time for vaccinating 40% of the world's population for any other epidemic or pandemic or any other viral disease had been 80 years, 40% of the world's population. This time we did it in 2. 40% of the world's population. Now, it was unfair. The rich people were at the front of the line and poor people were left out in many cases. But it still was an incredible difference from what we've seen before. So there is this opportunity for radical shifts in humankind's behavior and outlook that we can't even imagine at this moment. When I sit down with Ben and Kate and they express their despair about the state of the world and their fear, I say we don't actually understand these systems well enough to know what positive possibilities there are. But we do know that the world is very different from the way it has been before. And there may be opportunities that we can't even imagine. If you'd said on August the 18th, 2018, that a girl of 15 was going to sit on the steps of the Swedish Parliament buildings with a sign saying "School Strike for Climate," and she was going to mobilize hundreds of millions of people around the world and fundamentally change the conversation about climate around the world, you would have said, oh, that's a crazy idea. But there she is on August the 19th, 2018, Greta Thunberg, and she did it. Greta Thunberg created a possibility and made it real. There's this idea in complexity science called the adjacent possible. It's just what beyond the boundary of the real and the visible, things that we know are possible. And she saw that possibility. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she just felt she had to do something, and she pulled it into reality. We don't know what the other possibilities are at this point for radical change in the human future. So last slide. Second to last. When I talked to our kids and when I think about how I respond to these situations in very practical personal terms, in terms of my everyday life, I think about dividing my life into these 3 categories, or they suggest that they should divide their lives into these 3 categories of activity in order to sustain their hope. They need to work on developing the muscle of practical problem solving in every aspect of their lives. Fixing engines, growing food, building things, solving social problems, being an effective intermediary between contending groups. All of these are sort of the practical problems of which we're going to be faced in our everyday lives more and more in the future. And you need to get good. You need to have that kind of nimbleness and problem solving, sort of MacGyver-esque ability to figure out what's available in your immediate vicinity in terms of resources and get to work to solve problems. So that's the first. Work on being a better problem solver. Engage in whatever way you think is appropriate with addressing some of these problems. Just get involved. Even if you can't see that it's going to lead you necessarily to where we want to be in the future, getting involved is a very important way of making yourself more resilient psychologically in the face of these challenges. And then finally, experience. And I've come up with this silly little term. It's called TMIG. This moment is good. T-M-I-G. And every time I'm doing something, maybe I'm having a TMIG right now, every time I'm doing something where I think, ooh, this is really wonderful, I'm holding Sarah's hand, or I'm having a wonderful conversation with my kids, or seeing something beautiful outdoors, I just think, TMIG, right? Things are going to get rough, almost certainly. We need to recognize these moments, especially in this extraordinary place on the West Coast where things are beautiful and wonderful, and hold on to them and make sure that we see them and feel them. This is a kind of mindfulness. I'd like to put a label on it, the TMake label. But I think it's important to remind ourselves and to be able to remember that we did that in the times when things aren't so happy. So thank you very much. I really appreciate, despite the few technical glitches there, I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope we have a little good conversation for the next few minutes.
You want to take that first one? Well, Ted, you've left us, I think, 1 minute for questions, so I hope everybody can stay just a little bit longer. I really want to thank you for that really engaging and interesting presentation. I'll start with a few questions, but I do encourage the audience, of course, to use the QR code here to ask questions as well, and we will have the opportunity for some roving mics too. So please do think of your questions, and I'll get started on some of mine. As you were talking, actually, I was crossing out prospective questions because you were answering them. But you know, those slides you showed about what happened in British Columbia over the last few years, and many of us here in the room would have experienced that directly, you know, the heat dome, the fire, the atmospheric rivers, all of that, which hit us in quick succession. And I know you are a very close observer of, you know, you talked about the kind of stresses that are out there and trigger events. Are there any systems you're looking at right now that are worrying you, or that you are finding are heading towards those trigger events?
Well, climate change is kind of a first among equals. It's always there, and it seems to be, and I tried to stress how it's getting worse, but I think we're not paying as much attention right at the moment to potential financial instabilities within banking systems, within China. So one thing that's happened in consequence of the pandemic is that there was this shift in the equilibrium nature of the global economy from basically a low inflation, low interest rate regime with relatively low growth to a high inflation, high interest rate regime with still appears relatively low growth. But that shift has produced, we haven't seen the consequences work themselves through the global economy yet. It has produced enormous stress for the balance sheets and the business models of a lot of banks. You know, that's exactly why Silicon Valley Bank went bankrupt, and a lot of other regional and mid-sized banks and local banks in the United States are in danger. The Chinese financial situation is really quite concerning because of the collapse in property values and because municipalities have enormous amounts of debt, and they are and they have been able to sustain that debt by basically selling off the rights to develop land, and they can't do that anymore because a lot of the big developers are going bankrupt. So there's some fundamental contradictions in the Chinese economy that aren't getting the attention that they deserve. Then you know, the other place where I am really very concerned is that the progression of populist authoritarianism in the world seems to be, if not accelerating, it's certainly advancing pretty steadily. Erdogan in Turkey, you know, he was reelected. Trump is enormously strong in the United States at this point. I think he's going to bury DeSantis. I think he's going to get the Republican nomination, and he's got a very good shot at being president again. And then that changes the whole dynamic of the conflict in Eastern Europe with Russia and Putin. The Europeans will be on their own trying to support the Ukrainians at that point. So yeah, those are the things, besides climate change, those are the things that are really on my mind right at the moment. But then you've got this other stuff like large language model AI that's just popped out of the blue, that has this potential for radically changing the way we're operating our societies. And we haven't really, nobody's wrapped their heads around that. That's why the leaders of the AI companies are so worried. They just published a letter, I think yesterday, saying we need regulation because we don't know. So there you go. But this just keeps you awake at night, so let's talk about something else.
Well, you'll notice by the tone of my questions, I'm probably of the prudential temperament, so less on the hope side. But I wondered as well as if you could elaborate a little bit on how that synchronization works, because that's what I found so fascinating about your work, because I was of the view, and I think many of us were, that we were in the middle of a perfect storm, and I think you debunked the notion of a perfect storm and say this is actually a synchronization, and these crises feed off each other, they shape each other, and they kind of cascade into each other.
Right, so that's still a hypothesis. I mean, I would love to be proven wrong, and that this is just a coincidence. And we look back in 10 years and say, whoo, that was a really rough time, we had all this stuff happening. But what we're seeing as we look under the surface is we're seeing relationships and linkages between these problems. So that are tending to cause them to link together. And I sometimes put some causal diagrams up that shows how some of the systems are linking together. I think it's possible to model some of this quite effectively. So here's a key thing. Most big system modeling, for instance, for climate modeling or the economic impacts of climate, and with things called integrated assessment models, or going all the way back to World 3 models with limits to growth in the 1970s, they all try to kind of represent the whole system, right? Everything that's going on in the system, which is really hard because these global systems, human systems, technological and ecological and otherwise, are incredibly complex. So what we're doing in the Cascade Institute is instead we're dropping out the kind of 20 top stresses. Because they are reasonably slow moving, you can sort of track their trajectories over time. They may be nonlinear, maybe accelerating or something like this, but you can still see the trends. And then you look at the relationships between these stresses. And you abstract away from a lot of the rest of the complexity. You basically say, under normal circumstances, the world is a stabilized place. It's sitting in an equilibrium. It has what complexity scientists call homeostatic mechanisms, basically like the kinds of things that keep our body temperature at the same level all the time. So it's self-equilibrating, we don't understand all of those mechanisms, but we know they're there, and we don't have to figure them all out. We can see these stresses, and we know these stresses are actually weakening some of those mechanisms. So you look at the stresses and you look at how they are actually making the system less stable over time. And I think you can get much better predictive accuracy. The only other thing I'd say is that I'm even thinking of an acronym, find the positive feedbacks. Find positive feedback. Well, there it is. I tell my researchers, look for the positive feedbacks. These are not good feedbacks. These are self-reinforcing feedbacks where you get a cycle of causation that causes it to reinforce itself. Those positive feedbacks, which may cross several systems like climate, economic, pandemic, health systems, those positive feedbacks are where you're getting the synchronization. If you can find those, then you're making real headway on the synchronization effect. And then the other part of it is you look for the places where you can cut in and block them, because you don't want to just stand back and say, oh, this looks really bad. You need to actually do something about it. And the positive feedbacks may be places where you can go in and you can actually intervene. But that's a story still to be told with our research.
And before I turn to the audience questions, then a question on interventions. Can you give us just an example of an intervention which can make a big difference?
Well, I'm just going to talk about ultra-deep geothermal. I tell you, I can be a fanatic about this. I've studied climate issues for almost 40 years, and climate is basically an energy problem. And my second major book for a general audience, and it's out there on the table, is The Upside of Down, and it's all about the relationship between energy and society, energy and complexity in society. So complex systems require big inputs of energy. You can be more efficient, you can be more clever about how you use energy, but the bottom line is the technologies and the social complexity and the diversity of job occupations and everything else, and the levels of education that we have, that we enjoy, require enormous inputs of energy. And I use these figures as you know, in a presentation I made yesterday at Royal Roads. We're hooked on fossil fuels, and there's a reason why we are, because it's an extraordinary source of energy. 2 tablespoons of crude oil contain as much free energy as would be expended by an adult male laborer in a day. Every time you fill up your gas tank, if you still have a gas tank, you're putting 2 years of manual labor in that gas tank. We built this edifice, this extraordinarily complex society off fossil fuels. 40% of the carbon in your bodies comes from fossil fuels, from natural gas, coal, or oil. It's gone up into the atmosphere. It's been fixed through photosynthetic processes into your food, and then you've consumed it and incorporated it into your proteins. So we are a fossil fuel society. We have to solve the energy problem. We don't solve the energy problem, nothing else matters. And the only technology I can see, to answer your question directly, the only technology I can see that's going to get us anywhere close to where we need to be fast enough is ultra-deep geothermal. We can't do it with wind and solar. You just can't close the gap.
Thank you. Okay, we'll turn to questions. And are we taking questions?
We have quite a few from the code. We could probably have a whole evening.
Start with you, and then we'll take some.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The questions come through on the forum saying all from anonymous. However, if you would like to claim your question, you can simply raise your hand as I speak it aloud, and it will be addressed in that way, or you may remain anonymous.
I always like to speak to the person who's asked the question if it's at all possible.
One of the questions tonight is, what is one thing each of us can do starting tomorrow to make use of this information?
Right. Well, look, I'm a big believer in the fact that, despite the slide about changing the light bulbs, that small things do add up when they're done by enough people. And there's a lot of stuff we can do in our lives to change our habits, to change our consumption practices, to encourage governments to restructure the way energy is used. You know, in terms of your personality and temperament, it may not be the kind of thing you want to do to get involved in sort of local politics or otherwise, but getting engaged in some kind of social activity or social movement to push these changes forward. But then just on a practical level, just look around your household. At what you can do and change, and many of us, just about all of us, have already done a lot, right? But there's still more. You know, I was thinking, just to give you an example, and I don't know how I would solve this one. Today I was cooking a bunch of chicken for my kids, right, on the grill. And it was, they were boneless thighs. And I was thinking as I was flipping these things over on the grill, I was thinking, because I was reading recently, the research has come out that says that the avian flu that's wiping birds out around the world developed within poultry farms, right? So we have this situation where we get zoonotic viral jumping into poultry farms, and then they mutate within the poultry. The virus mutates within the poultry farms, and then it jumps back out into the wild populations and starts killing birds, in this case, all over the planet, right? And that's because we like cheap chicken. Well, I don't know exactly what the solution to this is, but it's time we figured this out. I'm a big fan of test tube meat, but you know, you got to think about it. You know, as I was flipping these things over, I was thinking, I'm part of the problem. We're all deeply embedded in these problems, and we need to be very aware of that, be paying attention and adjusting what we can do. If enough people do it, it starts to add up to a really big change.
Thanks. We take another question.
Just looking to the audience questions. Everyone's looking at me. All my questions are on the screen. Another question, if anyone would like to, again, claim their question, you can raise your hand. Would you talk about the roles of national governments in exacerbating or addressing polycrisis?
Right. Okay, so I'm a believer in government. Who asked the question? Hello there. So I'm a believer in government. I think government can be a force for good, and many of the problems we face are what social scientists would call common good or collective action problems, and actually require coordination from government to be addressed. So there is a political philosophy, of course, that is increasingly strong in the United States. The government is not good for anything, and you just have to get government out of the way. And it used to be kind of anti-government light view, just get it out of the market, let the market rip. But now it's like you don't want the government doing anything. And I think that is potentially catastrophic for addressing these problems. The problem is that most of our institutions in the democratic world evolved in the 18th and 19th centuries at a time when transportation, the fastest mode of transportation was horseback, and almost all information was communicated verbally. And now we're in a world that's just radically different, accelerating change. And our institutions are not designed for this. Among other things, we have things like the official opposition that has the job of opposing everything, right? Well, that made sense once, but now all the problems are so complex that just standing up and saying what's wrong isn't going to get you very far, and what people are doing wrong. So I think there's some really profound institutional challenges here. Government is essential, but the government we have right now is facing what I would call an ingenuity gap. It's not delivering solutions as fast as it needs to. And as a result, government is becoming less and less respected. I talked about the delegitimization of technocratic elites, political and technocratic elites. It's a real challenge. But governments that are governed by the rule of law and that are democratic in their fundamental normative framework and principles are going to be essential if we're going to get ahead of problems like climate change. And right now, they're kind of on the ropes.
That wasn't very helpful, but...
But it was honest.
It's honest. I think we had a hand up over here, I believe, yes. Do we have a mic? Sure. We'll bring a mic to you.
I've been hearing reports in the news about geothermal plants causing earthquakes.
Oh, good question.
And I was
like
wondering if
one.
you could address that.
Oh, I planted him so he could ask this question. Yeah, so I told you I can go on about this, but very quickly. There is conventional geothermal and then ultra deep. Conventional geothermal uses sedimentary drilling technology. You know, the cones, the drilling bits we are familiar with, the 3-cone bits, the drilling through limestone or sedimentary rock. And those wells tend to be fairly shallow. They're drilled through sedimentary rock in places where the heat is fairly close to the surface. And those wells the places where you can get that heat, and usually it's wet rock too. You were drilling into wet rock so you can get the hot water and bring it up to the surface to drive turbines. The big geysers geothermal plant in California is like that. It's a huge plant. But hot, wet rock close to the surface in sedimentary systems tends to exist along the boundaries of plates, where the plates are coming together, because the heat has come close to the surface of the earth in those areas. And of course, when you pump fluid down into those areas, you can induce earthquakes because it causes the plates to slip. So the reason you want to be able to go deep in hard rock to places, the reason you want to do that is because you can get away from those tectonically active zones and reduce the earthquake risk, probably to zero. Among other things, you're going so deep that even if there is a little bit of slippage down there, it's a long way away and it probably won't be felt on the surface. So there's a huge advantage from going from, say, 4 to 5 kilometers in sedimentary rock to 10 to 15 kilometers in igneous rock. But right now, just to give you a sense, if we want to drill a well in igneous rock to 10 kilometers, it will cost us $100 million. We need to get that price to make geothermal functional and economically viable down to between $5 and $10 million. We think it's technologically feasible as long as you aren't using conventional mechanical grinding technology. There are 4 possibilities out there: plasma, microwave, water jet, and percussive. And at least 3 of them are moving very fast, and Canadians aren't involved in any of them right at the moment.
I think you can tell Tad's passion for deep geothermal, so.
Okay, we'll stop on that one.
We'll take a couple more questions, and we have one down here. Thank you. We could get a mic. I think somebody's bringing you a mic. And yes, here we go. Thank you. And then there is a question up there later, so if you just stay there with the mic, that's great. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Tad. I'd like to maybe start by stating 2 truths, I guess. The first being that though this is a remarkable event, and you called yourself a nerd at one point when you had the Venn diagrams, and I too am a nerd in that way. But there are a surprisingly small amount of nerds who would show up to an event like this, read a book like this one that you've written, which is incredibly important. The other kind of truth is that art, that stories, that TV shows, streaming services, concerts, all these sort of things is remarkably powerful and popular. It reaches just about everyone. So if we are to tap into these high leverage intervention points and to solve these huge issues, could art, in the very general sense, story, etc., be used as one of those tools?
It's a great question, and the answer is absolutely. And I have been thinking about this for a long time. I mean, through my books, I do what I know best, which is to take ideas and try to make them more understandable for broad audiences. Important ideas, and I think there's more than a few nerds out there. I think there are a lot of aspiring nerds. And I also start from the premise, just on your first point, I start from the premise that everybody's smart. And it's just, you need to get a little bit of their time, and you need to walk through very carefully, say, the basics of thermodynamics, and I do that in The Upside of Down, or some of the basic things about the psychology of hope. And just about anybody can understand that and can understand why it's important. That in actual fact, many people are complex systems thinkers, even though they don't know it. They use concepts like, the straw that broke the camel's back, or the whole is more than the sum of parts. Well, the first one is the concept of nonlinearity, and the second one is the concept of emergence. So it's all there, you just have to draw it out and help people see the pieces. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, you're right, ultimately it's a very small slice. And if you want to reach people in a broad way, you need to evoke the emotions that come with stories. Some of the movies about climate change recently, which is the one with the meteorite that's going to hit the Earth. I was talking to somebody about it. Yeah, Don't Look Up, right? So I've actually, a person who's a big supporter of the Cascade Institute, Joe McInnes, is a very close friend of James Cameron's. And I've been having this kind of distant conversation with James Cameron. Because James Cameron is probably one of the greatest, I guess you could say, he's a contemporary storyteller, right? With an enormous sway. And you can tell where he falls on these issues, because Avatar is all about changing our relationship to the natural world. I think there are opportunities for reaching people in new ways, emotionally powerful ways across those three emotional temperaments that we haven't exploited. And I think people like James Cameron have an intuition for that they haven't exploited yet effectively.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, there's a question at the top there, and I think right here, yes.
Hi.
Thank you.
My question is about electric cars.
I have one, so careful.
Yeah, I have a hybrid, but you said that 75% of the carbon is caused by fossil fuels, and we definitely need to do something about that. So electric cars seems on the surface like a good idea, but of course, as we all, I'm sure, are aware, is that the lithium that's needed to create the batteries are mined in places like Congo, where human rights are zero, it seems. Children are killing themselves for us. And the idea of recycling those batteries are huge. What's it going to take before we can get to that point? And the infrastructure that is needed for transforming within just a few short years, if Trudeau is correct, it does seem to be quite impossible. I came here tonight because I really do want to hope. But I find that there's so many times when we think, oh, there's the great technology, that we soon discover that is not so great.
Yeah, so there's no silver bullets, and I would say that that's going to be almost certainly the case with ultra-deep geothermal too. There will be challenges and consequences that have to be managed. So, and you're right about everything you're saying about electric vehicles. Although, first of all, it's 75% of the primary consumption of energy is still fossil fuels in the world. And that's budged from what, 78%. Like, we've just made very little difference in the last few years. But changing the transportation system is a really critical part of that. And one way or the other, it has to be electrified. It's just, we can reduce the amount we use vehicles and cars, and I think there's some space for adaptation there. We can increase the public transport, live more densely in cities. Some of those changes will take a long time because they involve infrastructural changes. But overall, the transportation is going to have to electrify. So there is rapid progress on battery technology. I was at a meeting at McGill University just a few weeks ago talking about ways of reducing the amount of lithium. Recycling is going to get much more effective. Batteries will eventually be standardized. There'll be robotic factories, and they'll be pulled apart in the same ways, and we'll get pretty close to 100% material recycling. So the general conclusion of this conference, of this workshop I was at, of the experts who were there, is that we have enough of these minerals in the world to run a world transportation system off electricity using batteries, but we don't have enough if we need batteries to stabilize our grids because we've got intermittent power from solar and wind, okay? And of course, there's a huge demand for batteries to stabilize the grid now. If those batteries, though, don't have to be lithium-based. They can be other kinds of batteries. They can be big, bulky. They don't have to be mobile. They can be hydraulic batteries. There are all kinds of things you can do there. Or we don't rely so heavily on wind and solar. The bottom line is, for EVs, there's no way out of this climate change problem if we don't electrify the transportation system. We have to figure out to do it with the least load and pressure on the global ecosystems possible, with all of the political and social consequences you're talking about. Eventually, most of the need for these metals will be met through recycling, probably 80 or 90%. There'll be enough in the system that it can be recycled through the system. But it's a big problem. There's no question about it. I would say, though, I would trade an EV system with all the battery issues over the fossil fuel system that's wrecking the planet any day, right? You'd add up the negatives on the fossil fuel side versus the negatives on the emerging electric vehicle side, and there's no comparison.
So I've seen many, many hands, and I know we are way over time. I'm going to give the last, there's an opportunity to talk to Tad afterwards up in the lobby, so I'm going to give the last question. Is that Jasmine? Yeah. Yes, Jasmine. Hi, Jasmine. And if you could bring a mic down here, please. Thank you.
Hi. What struck me about your presentation is the lack of intersectional analysis, application of critical race theory, and the historical to contemporary engagement of settler colonialism. I think it's very easy to say to your children that you're not doomed if you're white, because we know from the research on environmental racism that these violences and disasters are spread disproportionately toward BIPOC communities. Many BIPOC scholars evidence that we are not all part of the same community when you refer to identity. We simply can't be when the intersections of class, race, power, and more, those dynamics differentiate our access to everything. It's too simplistic to think that we can categorize people into their temperaments because those temperaments are determined by their intersections in the communities and identities aforementioned. So how do you reframe your idea of hope to communities that this specific conception that you've explained might not apply to as is, specifically BIPOC communities? And just a side question, if you have time, how do you engage with degrowth theories of capitalism in your work? Thank you.
Yeah, so I take this really, really seriously, okay? And you're right, I didn't address them in my presentation. They are certainly addressed in aspects of our research at the Cascade Institute. So, for instance, one of our researchers has been doing a very detailed, thoughtful study of the nature of power and how power is expressed and used within societies. And I also will be first to admit that I am not well positioned to understand a lot of the challenges that the BIPOC communities and others face. And I would leave it to others to try to explain to me so I can understand better. Nonetheless, I would challenge you on a few points, and we can have a separate conversation about this. The differences between us are minuscule when we look at the human species as a whole, biological differences. We are a common species, right? And we are facing some species-wide challenges on this planet. Now, the responsibility for addressing those challenges is going to weigh most heavily on those with the greatest wealth and power and opportunity. And so the responses that are unfold at a global level will almost inevitably involve, if they're going to be just and fair, if we're going to be really committed to those principles of justice and fairness, very substantial redistribution of wealth and power. It's inescapable. People don't want to hear that. People at the top of the heap just don't want to hear that. But I'm happy to say it. I say it in the book, quite explicitly in the book. How that's going to happen without monumental violence is a really open question. And I think that if I put my hope somewhere, is that we are in such an unusual situation in the history of the species now that maybe there will be new moral and normative and cultural and identity developments that will help us pull together around these problems. But it's not going to happen without a lot of trauma. The first process is, as scarcity becomes worse, the first things that will happen is that people start fighting with each other, because that's kind of what we've done in the past. Then at some point there might be a dawning realization that this is actually not going to get us to where we need to be. And what evolves in terms of a moral framework, an identity framework out of that, I don't think we can say at this point. So we're under enormous stress. And that creates potential opportunities. I would like to think that in 2100, post-2100, that we've gone through this critical period of trauma and transition and ended up with much more humane society, where the kinds of diverse groups that have been on the outside of the power hierarchies are now able to flourish like everyone else can. I think that possibility is still before us. So that's my answer to the first question, except I'd say that the temperamental differences, I think I could show you some research that suggests they exist in all categories, in all groups. That yes, the power relationships and the intersectionality within societies causes them to be expressed in somewhat different ways, but the underlying temperamental differences are common across all cultures and all social groups. So let's put that aside and we can continue the conversation. On the degrowth stuff, and this, I have an extended section in the book about it too, about growth and the challenge of growth. It's very easy to talk about degrowth, but 40% of the world's population still lives on $5 a day or less. And they aspire to what we have. And we can't just say, oh, sorry, we got it, and now you can't dump your carbon into the atmosphere because, again, it's this redistributive issue. We have to go out of our way at this point and we're not doing a good job. We're supposed to have $100 billion in a fund to make this happen globally, but we have to actually make it possible for the less economically advantaged people in the world to leapfrog over this dirty development phase, technologically dirty development phase. And at the moment, we're not investing the resources. So I'll just finish with something that may strike folks as a little bit unusual, but I think it's true. You can hope for things that are low probability. There's a false assumption out there that hope requires a high probability of the outcome you're hoping for, but that's not the case. You know, any of you who are physicians and you've had to tell somebody that they're desperately ill, to say terminally ill, or could be terminally ill, critically ill, you say, you know, you've got a 5% chance of living. And the person will say, okay, what can I do to make sure I fall in that 5%? They will hope for that 5%. Any of us would, right? I think the chances, just looking at the situation right now with all of the stuff that's coming towards us and our deep commitment to fossil fuel consumption, the problems of systemic injustice within our societies that you're talking about, doesn't look good. What are we at? 5%, 10% of having a humane society in 2100 or beyond, 20%. So sometimes I speak to young people a lot, and the parents get really upset with me, but the young people don't. And they come up to me and say, so what do you think the chances are we're going to pull out of this in a way that's, you know, a world that we want? I don't know. What are the chances? It's too complex a system to be sure, but what? 20%. Let's say 20%. And they say, okay, 20%. And they walk off, and they're going to aim for that 20%. They're going to hope for that 20%, and they're going to work for that 20%, right? So I think it's kind of a mug's game to try to estimate how big a chance there is. We just need to all work and try to open up as many possibilities as possible for creating the more just and prosperous society, broadly based. I'm serious about that justice and fairness thing, right? Well, you heard hints of John Rawls and what I'm saying, and we can have a separate conversation about John Rawls, but yes, I think that we need to think about where we would situate ourselves if we didn't know where we were coming in, what kind of principles of justice we would adopt if we didn't know what kind of social status we were going to have in our society. And then it turns out that we come up with something resembling the golden rule, or Kant's categorical imperative, that we need to create a system that is fair as possible, regardless of where you're situated socioeconomically in it. So anyway, I think that's it.
We have to end. We are way over time. It was a really fascinating conversation. Thank you. So I really want to thank you, Ted, for joining us tonight and giving us a lot to think about. And thank you for those wonderful questions, too. Ted's going to be up at the registration desk afterwards to sign books if you're interested, and I encourage you to stop by and continue the conversation. The other thing is I would love to thank our sponsor, the Victoria Times Colonist, and thank you to the Royal Road staff who helped coordinate this wonderful event. But thank you most of all to all of you who came out to join us tonight. I really, really love seeing you all here. We will have more Changemakers Speaker Series coming up later this year. So watch the website, rruchangemakers.ca, or follow our social media channels. And see you next time. And good night, everybody. Have a great evening. Thank you.